The Sleeping City was a 1950 crime thriller featuring a murder mystery with an undercover investigation taking place at a hospital in the city. Directed by George Sherman, the film starred Richard Conte as an undercover detective posing as a medical intern, with Coleen Gray as a mysterious nurse who might know more than she lets on. This was a great crime film, notable for being filmed on location at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. I'll give a summary of the film, spoiler-free, and then offer some closing thoughts. Well, the film opens up with Richard Conte talking right to the audience, telling us that this is a work of fiction filmed at Bellevue Hospital. Now, from what I've read about the film, they added this intro in order to pacify New York Mayor O'Dwyer's objection of the negative portrayal of hospital procedures. So we are told from the beginning that this story is just fictitious and did not actually take place in any particular U.S. city. And then on to the movie we go. Well, the film opens up with Dr. Foster, actor Hugh Riley, later of the Lassie TV series, and he's out for a walk and a smoke when abruptly somebody rushes up to him and shoots him. Well, Police Inspector Gordon arrives, played by actor John Alexander, and starts asking questions of people at the hospital. He interviews various staff members, and the questions all seem to lead nowhere. The staff only mention that this Dr. Foster seemed tired and wanted to just go out for a smoke. But no one seems to have any motive to have wanted to kill Foster, and none of the people questioned seem to be able to help the inspector at all. So, back at his office, this inspector speaks with Lieutenant Miller, actor Robert Strauss, who is convinced there's some psycho out there who committed the crime. So he gets rolling to work the psycho line. And by the way, Robert Strauss is only briefly in this film, but I had to mention him because he's one of those great actors. He was also in Stalag 17. Well, anyhow, the inspector meets with the chief detective, and he wants to use his confidential squad. So he explains that they're going to bring in this undercover character, the name of Fred Gilbert, and this is Richard Conte's character. Now, this Fred Gilbert actually does have some medical experience from the war, and he will be posing here as an intern, all the while investigating this murder. So he's asked a bunch of questions to test him out, both personal and professional, and we see that Dr. Fred can kind of cover all of this with no issues. He's able to kind of maintain this cover that they've developed for him. So Dr. Fred has made it into the system, and the first thing is that he joins with some new interns for their welcome meeting to the hospital. Finds out all about the hospital, and they get a tour, including a look at things like the main kitchen, which is pretty wild to see, serving 9,000 meals a day. And he's told he'll be working at the hospital with Nurse Anne. Nurse Anne is played here by actress Coleen Gray. And then once the tour is finished, he gets to his room, and he meets with Dr. Steve Anderson, played by Alex Nicole, who's going to be his roommate. Now, Steve is initially a little cold to him, like that side of the room is yours, this side is mine, that sort of thing. But then he does seem to warm up a little bit and opens up with him to get to know him. They talk, and Fred finds out that he's in love with a student nurse named Kathy, played by actress Peggy Dow, and he's got a big old chip on his shoulder, but we don't really know why. Fred starts to casually ask some questions, maybe to get to the bottom of the murder mystery about Foster, but he doesn't get very far. Now, later in the break room, we meet the character Pop Ware, played by Richard Tabor. He's the elevator operator there at the hospital, kind of a kindly old man, and he tells Fred that he often places racing bets for the doctors there. But Fred also learns that many of them are actually deeply in debt to Pop. Well, Dr. Fred heads back to his rounds, and he is summoned by Nurse Anne to see a patient in a coma. It's a diabetic patient with a hip fracture, and he's needed there. He seems a little reluctant, as this is a pretty big deal. Well, he checks out the patient, who is tossing and turning in a heavy sweat, and when Fred finds out that his arm veins have thrombosis, the nurse says there's a good vein in his leg, and oh my gosh, that is a massive syringe. But thankfully, all of the medical stuff takes place just out of view, so don't worry, and the patient makes it through. Phew! Well, Fred doesn't stick around, and he heads back to his room, maybe a little overwhelmed from that experience. It's like the real deal right there. Now, Steve seems to be all frustrated about things in his life, but Fred encourages him. Maybe he should just marry Kathy to be happy. But Steve just kind of dismisses this idea. Well, during his night rounds, Dr. Fred helps an old guy, who kind of looks like Abe Vigoda, with getting back to sleep because of his pain. And then he and Nurse Ann go out for a smoke, because doctors in this film just love their smokes. And Ann asks him questions and tries to get to know him a little bit better, asking things like if he's got a girl back home, that sort of thing, kind of showing maybe some romantic interest in this new doctor. Well, later in the break room, Steve is pretty plastered, and he is just broadcasting to everyone that he's going to marry Kathy and leave medicine. But then he just sort of breaks down, just depressed from his whole situation. Fred leaves to meet with the inspector a little bit later to report in and give him some thoughts about Steve's suspicious behavior. Later he heads back to his room, but finds some police detectives there, and it turns out Steve is dead. Lieutenant Lally, actor Frank Thomas, has got a lot of questions and a lot of suspicions of Dr. Fred, and they bring him downtown for questioning. They keep hammering at him, but then Kathy arrives with a suicide note that had been slipped under her door. So Fred is cleared, and he brings her back home and tries to comfort her. And he's starting to get suspicious of this character, Pop, as possibly being the key to everything, and decides that he will get hooked with some bets to see where this will lead. But what will this turn up? Well, with not much of the film left, I'm going to wrap up the overview here without spoiling much of the ending. But it is a very exciting conclusion, so I'll let you watch this one and check out the ending for yourself. But let me wrap this one up. The Sleeping City was released in 1950. It was directed by George Sherman and produced by Universal. My thoughts on this one, that this was a beautifully crafted crime film. Director George Sherman and cinematographer William Miller really present a film that is a clean and crisp black and white, and all of that marvelous hospital location footage adds such a real, authentic feel to this movie. As I've said many times before in early reviews, I'm just a nut for real location settings in a film, especially from older films like this one, and the extensive filming that was used throughout Bellevue Hospital. It just added such a confining realism. It's almost claustrophobic at times, as these interns, they seem to rarely see the light of day. It's even brought up earlier in the film that when the interns are going through their initial training, the lead instructor takes them out on a rooftop to see the skyline and tells them, "Take a good look. This is the last you'll see of it for a long time." I especially like things like the old-style cafeteria with the hospital food walls with the little cubbies serving cake. I love that sort of thing, that window into the past. Or even the surgical theater, which I can't watch without thinking of Kramer eating his junior mints. And look, I'm sure I'm not alone on this, but hospitals just automatically give me an uneasy feeling. The enclosed rooms with surgical tables, that icky, you can almost smell it in your head, the rubbing alcohol smell, the clattering of creepy metal instruments and so on. And, even though this is a hospital of the early 50s, with none of the modern things like the beeping monitors and so on, there's still enough creep factor from that era that I thought complemented the murder investigation story so nicely in this film. And I will say this, I watched this film and never really felt like I was anywhere but within the confines of an old hospital. With the exception of maybe a couple few scenes where the character was outside of Bellevue and walking the city streets. Now, here's another observation. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, is when you watch black and white films that are set in a city, when it's depicted visually with nothing other than black, white, and grayscale, the city just feels so much more colder and lifeless. And maybe that's why it's such a perfect setting for old noir. I don't know. I've been to cities like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and they're much more colorful than you will ever see depicted in an old crime film like this. And I just loved the visuals of the city frequently through this film. And again, credit to William Miller's cinematography. I would actually just pause the film and just grab some screenshots because, again, visually this film could be such a treat, especially those city scenes. They just look so gritty and realistic. Now, Richard Conte was fantastic in the lead, and I really respect his range as an actor. because I've seen him in other films. And like one that comes to mind, a role he was in that I distinctively remember was that of the ice-cold crime boss in the film The Big Combo from 1955. Here in this movie, he's this soft-spoken, mild-mannered, undercover investigator, and one very good at his job, and he's such a far cry from the Big Combo. I'm really looking forward to seeing more of his films as I continue the channel. And of course, Coleen Gray was very sweet and lovely as the head nurse at this hospital, and I thought she added a color and a charm to an otherwise very cold and sanitized hospital environment of the film. And I just love seeing her in any of these old films. She's been in quite a few reviews I've done on my channel, and I just think she's adorable. Now, an observation about the story here is that a lot of times when I watch a man undercover type of crime film, where the guy's deep undercover with like a crime boss or something like that, one of the things I watch for is the inevitable will his cover be blown scene, like someone randomly recognizes the undercover guy and the cover's blown or that sort of thing. It's usually a big deal in a film like that, but in this film, it barely happens. I mean, only once, briefly in passing, does this undercover Dr. Fred almost have an interaction with somebody who might have blown his cover because they were supposed to have gone to the same college. But that is quickly avoided and the film moves on and without his secret identity being revealed. Now, as part of research in this film, I looked a little into the history of Bellevue Hospital. And this location is pretty fascinating. So basically, Bellevue Hospital goes back 3 centuries. Founded in the 1730s, it's America's oldest public hospital. Now, early in the country's history, it was a public-run institution. And when different immigrant groups would come to the country, often there would be diseases that would come with them, like cholera, typhus, and so on. And this hospital would sort of be ground zero for that, with no one turned away. Bellevue featured the first nursing school, the first maternity ward, and later would become notorious for its psychiatric wing. Nellie Bly was an undercover reporter that exposed the hospital and its various practices in 10 Days in a Madhouse. It was an expose that linked Bellevue with insanity and made it something of a punchline, You would see an old film or a show and it would refer to something like, I'm going to send you to Bellevue, which basically was synonymous with that person was crazy. I mean, even like Kris Kringle was sent there in The Miracle on 34th Street. So as of today, Bellevue Hospital is still in operation. It's located on 462 First Avenue in Manhattan. And today it operates as NYC Health and Hospitals of Bellevue and remains a major center for medical care, education, and public health. And now you know. Well, let me wrap up. The Sleeping City from 1950 was an enjoyable, I would say underrated crime film that included a gritty, realistic atmosphere set largely within this inner city hospital environment. And it really makes for a great film. All of those hospital elements combined with the murder mystery. Richard Conte brought a strong performance as that undercover investigator, while Coleen Gray balanced things out with warmth, and the story just unfolded at a good pace with a very exciting resolution. George Sherman's direction was excellent, and again, that beautiful imagery of the city really made this a fantastic hidden gem from 1950. And I would say this is definitely one worth checking out.